So what's the plan here exactly? We couldn't find anyone willing to let us interview them, so we're just going to talk to ourselves from now on?
No, that's not it at all. We're still going to do interview episodes. We're just trying something new here, okay?
Sometimes, Storycraft asks questions. Other times, Storycraft offers... not answers exactly. Impressions, insights, interpretations.
Snacks?
Will you accept mental snacks?
No, physical snacks only.
Actually, studies have shown that regular intellectual stimulation promotes the growth of new brain cells and strengthens neural connections. So in that sense, mental snacks are also physical snacks.
Can we just get on with it already?
This introduction is one of the dumbest things we've ever put on the internet, and that's saying something.
Everyone, please just shut up. Respectfully, this is going to be great. I promise. External voice, take it away.
I recently rolled credits on Esoteric Eb, the Disco Elysium-inspired TTRPG turned CRPG developed by Christopher Beaudegard, and it made me realize a couple of things about myself. 1. My soul yearns to be a dick-ass rogue who's sneaky enough to steal a weapon right out of your hands, but still takes most of my civic responsibilities seriously. And I'm grateful to Esoteric Eb for allowing me to virtually live out that fantasy. 2. I really enjoy games in which the player character has a voice, or better yet, multiple voices, bouncing around in their brain and vying for attention. And no, I don't just mean the character has an internal monologue that's audible and or visible to the player. That's called thinking, and it's a relatively common phenomenon, or so I'm told. What I'm talking about are voices that are portrayed as independent from, and oftentimes at odds with, the protagonist's established self-image, usually for one of two reasons. 1. The voices are autonomous characters in their own right, but cannot be seen or heard by NPCs. So the resulting effect is kind of like if your childhood imaginary friend turned out to be real the whole time. 2. The voices are aberrant facets of the player character's psyche that have taken on lives of their own, such as self-doubt manifesting as a dark, negative voice that attempts to deter the character from their chosen path. In either case, these voices showcase personalities, speech patterns, and points of view that are separate from the protagonist's baseline stream of consciousness despite essentially existing within it. And as a player, I find that dynamic fascinating to engage with. Internal voices, for lack of a better term, often function primarily as narrators, but the majority of video game narrators are not internal voices. It's a real, many sea cucumbers are deep sea creatures, but not all deep sea creatures are sea cucumbers sort of situation. A well-known and relatively recent example of a classic video game narrator is Amelia Tyler's voiceover in Baldur's Gate 3, which exists to provide meta-commentary for the player. She's our exposition dispenser, our dungeon master, if you want to put it in tabletop terms. She's there to explain what Tav, or your origin character of choice, is thinking, feeling, or recalling so the developers don't have to show it all on screen, to provide additional context for what we are seeing on screen, and to remind us of information we've encountered earlier but may have forgotten. Her astute and sometimes slightly seductive commentary elaborates on the protagonist's experience using second-person pronouns like you and your to facilitate role-playing and bridge the gap between the player and their character. Not because she's speaking directly into Tav's cerebral cortex like a mind flayer tadpole that wants to be a newscaster when it grows up. Simply put, Amelia Tyler isn't for Tav. Amelia Tyler is for us. A narrator becomes an internal voice when the player character, and only the player character, is able to hear and respond to their remarks, which opens the door to some really fun interactions, particularly from a comedic standpoint. One of my favorite narrators that fits this bill is the storyteller in Hades, referred to simply as Old Man by Zagreus, but who we now know to be a representation of the poet Homer thanks to Hades 2. Though his identity was somewhat apparent from the get-go, especially if you poked around the house decor. The fact remains that Zag never thought to ask the name of this omniscient, disembodied voice who'd been his constant companion for years. And that's just funny. Logan Cunningham's voice work is legendary, and his storyteller characters are often among the highlights of any given Supergiant game. But what elevates his role in Hades to the top of my list is the delightful contrast between Zagreus' light, irreverent manner of speaking, and Homer's much more eloquent and dignified delivery. Much of the writing in Hades is humorous, but at its heart, the game is a family drama of Olympic proportions. And the tonal discrepancy between our protagonist and his real-time biographer helps maintain the perfect balance between entertaining players and keeping them emotionally invested in the story. The rare moments when Zagreus flusters Homer, or Homer actually manages to get Zag to take something seriously, represent some of the most engaging writing in the game. Not to mention there are very convenient means of conveying important information to both protagonist and player.
Thus did Prince of the Underworld Zagreus absorb the contents of this hidden letter, written in his mother's hand.
His mother's hand? My mother's hand? Wait, what? You're saying this Persephone, that she's my mother? But Father always said that Nyx was that liar. He lied to me. They both did. All my life.
Thus did the prince discover, inadvertently, the well-kept truth about his lineage. Entirely by chance, this did occur.
Homer's a pretty subdued dude, a real professional poet, always maintaining some semblance of distance between himself and his muse by refusing to address Zagreus directly, even in instances where he's clearly reacting to something Zag has said. Not all narrators who function as internal voices for player characters operate within those constraints, however. Some games seem to take great pleasure in saying, screw your boundaries. Yes, you specifically, and turning the mental fuckery up a few notches by having their narrators make frequent, meaningful distinctions between conveying information to the player and speaking directly to the protagonist. One example that I'm particularly fond of is INDIKA, a game in which our storyteller is a voice we're told belongs to the devil himself. What a fascinating and deeply inconvenient companion to have, especially for a nun like our dear INDIKA. One might expect this to be a clear example of an unreliable narrator. And to be fair, his manner of speaking does smack of whatever the third-person limited approximation of a hellish hodgepodge of the Picaro, the clown, and the madman archetypes might be called. He's vulgar, mocking, cynical, and manipulative. But it also doesn't take long for us to realize that he's providing a pretty damn accurate account of INDIKA's innermost thoughts, much to her chagrin. The Devil's commentary, spoken for the player's benefit and referring to INDIKA in the third person, intermittently provokes INDIKA to interject, especially when an observation is just too embarrassing or implicating for her to brush off. In these instances, she verbally responds to the voice in her head, even if NPCs are there to witness what appears to be her talking to herself, which in turn prompts the Devil to shift his focus to engaging her directly.
Meeting a prisoner who talks to God would not be an everyday occurrence. Also, INDIKA took a liking to him.
Who, this one? No.
One way or another, there was certainly no doubt that she had to head for Spasov and not the Danilov monastery.
The letter. I cannot neglect my duty. What if there's something important in it?
Open it. See for yourself.
No.
What makes INDIKA such a compelling protagonist is that she's naive, kind, and gentle, as any nun worth her pillar of salt would be. But she's also not afraid to ask questions, ponder subjects deemed inappropriate by her religion, and engage in the type of painful self-reflection that her sisters would balk at. And that's all largely due to the influence of the fiend residing in her mind. Whether you choose to believe this devil character is actually an independent entity or just a representation of INDIKA's internal conflict with her faith, the important thing is that INDIKA sees him as the former, and by God does this make her much more interesting to play as. Blasphemy intended, by the way. Let's move on to the most literal of the internal voices we encounter in games, full-fledged NPCs who have found themselves inhabiting the protagonist's mind, usually because they lack a body of their own, their body has been rendered inoperable, or they're projecting their consciousness from a different location or plane of existence. Long story short, the player character has, through scientific, magical, or spiritual means, effectively been possessed by an NPC, though the relationship isn't typically as toxic as a Pazuzu or Payman sort of deal. Whether the involved characters consider the arrangement to be horribly invasive, mildly inconvenient, or incredibly intimate, usually depends on the circumstances surrounding the mental merger, the amount of control the NPC is able to exert over the player character's body, and, perhaps most importantly, their general compatibility as roommates. Unlike a narrator, an internal voice of this variety wasn't added to the game for the purpose of providing immediately relevant context to the player. Instead, there's usually a story behind how they became a psychic passenger, and aside from that tiny detail, they function much like a typical companion NPC would, sharing their own perspective and influencing the player character's decisions to varying degrees, whether that's by making the occasional polite request, attempting to physically hijack their brain, or anything in between. Arguably the most famous example of this character type is Johnny Silverhand, rocker boy, poster boy, and mostly endearing douchebag from Cyberpunk 2077. At this point in the established Cyberpunk timeline, the OG Johnny has been dead for over 50 years, and the NPC we're introduced to is his digitized ghost, a replication of his consciousness that gets transferred to protagonist V's brain. It's a cohabitation situation that both characters are none too pleased with, which immediately creates an undercurrent of tension for the player and encourages them to consider what selfhood and autonomy can really amount to when your mind, the thing that makes you you, and the thing that makes V, is forced to accommodate someone else. How Johnny and V's relationship ultimately turns out depends on player choices, but regardless of their friendship level, one thing's for certain. Johnny will periodically convey untruthful information to V, partly due to the malleable, subjective nature of memories, and partly due to Johnny being a dick.
Yep, third gig. Remember it like it was yesterday. Set my axe on fire, then smashed it on the stage. Crowd went wild.
Well, can't wait all day.
Easy. Johnny lit up his axe, then smashed it.
Nope. Knew it. Who smashes their gear when they're just starting out? I mean, a new one costs eddies.
Fucking hell, Johnny. Why the sabotage? Why now?
'Cause it's funny, 'cause I'm bored. Maybe I don't like the cut of your conformist jib.
To me, the idea of sharing a brain with anyone in real life sounds like an absolute nightmare. But it's admittedly a very fun relationship to explore vicariously, at least when we're talking about something like V having to deal with Johnny's antics. Fun isn't always the most applicable descriptor for internal voices, however, especially in games when they're meant to be a realistic depiction of psychosis. The gold standard for this category is, of course, the Hellblade series and its protagonist Senua, who suffers from a variety of severe psychosis-related symptoms, including hallucinations, delusions, and most notably, voice hearing. Mental illness was still considered a relatively taboo subject during the development of Hellblade's Senua's Sacrifice, so Ninja Theory approached their portrayal of Senua with the utmost care, consulting with neuroscientists and individuals who had personally lived with psychosis in order to represent the experience as authentically as possible. Within the game's first 2 minutes, the player is immersed in a chorus of whispers referred to as the Furies, whose voice lines were recorded using a dual microphone technique called binaural audio to replicate a 3D stereo sound through headphones. The Furies are perpetually in motion, speaking to Senua and each other from a variety of angles, distances, and volumes, worrying, questioning, ridiculing, encouraging, and observing, sometimes all at once. There are times when their commentary is genuinely helpful, such as when they warn you an enemy is about to strike or urge you to use the focus mechanic during combat, but mostly, the constant chatter is disconcerting, just as it was meant to be. One Fury stands apart from the rest. a gentle yet authoritative voice who takes notice of the player's arrival and speaks to them directly over the course of the game. That's right, folks, we've got ourselves a narrator. Her presence is what allows Hellblade's atmosphere to tread the line between uncomfortable and overwhelming, keeping us grounded amidst the chaos of Senua's mind and making sure her actions are appropriately contextualized.
Let me tell you about Senua. Her story has already come to an end, but now it begins anew.
What's happening? It's breathing. Dead. It's breathing. It's breathing. He knows she's getting closer. He can feel her coming closer. She's getting closer. They're watching. They're watching. They're watching.
This is a journey deep into darkness. There will be no more stories after this one.
As if the Furies weren't enough, Senua's psychic ensemble includes 2 additional voices. Memories or hallucinations of her friend Druth, who serves as a guide to the Norse legends featured in the game, and a bleak, contemptuous voice reminiscent of Senua's father, who's the main spokesperson for what Senua refers to as the darkness within her. It's a lot to process from both a sensory and an informational perspective, but of course, that's the whole point. As the narrator puts it, the hardest battles are fought in the mind, and Hellblade does a remarkable job of allowing us to experience those battles on behalf of Senua, thanks to the careful writing, acting, sound design, and research that went into the creation of this franchise. Another game that places a multitude of voices within the confines of the player character's brain is Slay the Princess, which, as some of you have probably noticed by now, is right behind 1000 Times Resist on the list of media I just can't seem to shut up about. In the game's first chapter, we're cast in the role of an unnamed protagonist and introduced to a pair of internal voices. One of them is a narrator, shocking, I know, who chronicles our actions and somewhat reluctantly engages in conversation. He encourages us to slay the titular princess, provides vague explanations if prodded, and expresses frustration when we inevitably deviate from the very simple path he's outlined for us. Unlike the narrators of INDIKA and Hellblade, Slay the Princess's narrator does not acknowledge the player's presence in the story he's telling. For all intents and purposes, we are the mysterious, reluctantly regicidal protagonist who's always trying to catch a glimpse of himself in a pesky, disappearing mirror. Our second internal voice is explicitly labeled the voice of the hero, and seems to be a representation of the player character's conscience. He advocates for moral, diplomatic choices, expresses sympathy for the princess, and seems generally wary of the narrator's slay first, ask questions later attitude. It's not immediately clear why this facet of our psyche exists as an independent personality, but his company is certainly comforting, and he feels like someone we can trust, unlike that dodgy narrator fellow. The player character's mind starts to get a bit more crowded and a lot more interesting. Spoiler alert if you haven't played Slay the Princess yet and want to go in with as little outside influence as possible. Following our first death. As it turns out, slaying a princess is more difficult than you might expect, especially if you accidentally turn her into an eldritch horror, a feral beast, or a perfectly ordinary girl who just happens to have a bunch of blades under her skin. Everything goes dark and you die, and find yourself right back on the path in the woods where you began the game. Except this time, your mind is playing host to a party of 3. The new voice represents another fragment of the player character's mind and reflects the manner in which they died and/or killed. For example, the voice of the cold makes an appearance if you steeled your nerves, suppressed your feelings, and slayed the princess as matter-of-factly as possible, while the voice of the broken will tag along if you accepted your inadequacy and readily surrendered to death. Due to my deep suspicion of both the narrator and the princess, and my subsequent futile attempt at leaving my problems literally behind closed doors, my first new psychological companion was the voice of the paranoid. I like the voice of the paranoid. Given the circumstances, he seems like a very reasonable guy.
A terrible sense of deja vu. No, you don't have that. This is the first time either of us have been here. If he doesn't remember what happened, then maybe it's best to keep it that way. Shh! What if he hears us? That's a very good question, little voice. What if he does hear you?
What I enjoy most about Slay the Princess is that it thematically and mechanically speaks to the broad spectrum of individual player choices. Different people will interpret and respond to the same scenario in a variety of ways. And though there's obviously a finite number of branching paths contained within the game, the developers did an admirable job of accounting for as many potential perspectives as possible. In some ways, the voices you accumulate over the course of a playthrough reflect the way you personally see the world. And they mock you for it. There are no correct choices, only different ways to die. Speaking of death, resurrection, and waking up in a morgue filled with apples, we've finally made it back to Esoteric Eb and the internal voices that inspired this video simply because I enjoyed them so damn much. Right off the bat, there's one key difference between these voices and the voices we voiced our thoughts about earlier. Esoteric Eb has no voice cast, so the player character's internal voices aren't voiced by actual voices. You know that thing that happens when you've used a word so many times it starts to become just a sound with no meaning, but you also can't stop saying it? Yeah, we've officially reached that point. One moment, please.
Hello, everyone!
Shit, fuck ass, Marty!
As I was saying, the audio in Esoteric Eb is limited to music and sound effects, so the tones, diction, and personalities of each character are conveyed entirely through the game's writing, which, luckily for us, is excellent. It's probably apparent just from watching a few minutes of gameplay footage that Esoteric Eb is unabashedly inspired by Disco Elysium. One of the most notable similarities between the two games is that ability scores, which each represent an aspect of the player character's brain, have their own unique voices that engage in dialogue and comment on events related to their respective faculties. Disco Elysium features a whopping 24 skills located in protagonist Harry Dubois' posterior neocortex alone, plus unique voices for his ancient reptilian brain, limbic system, and spinal cord. The resulting mental chorus is nuanced, engaging, and an undoubtedly impressive feat of storytelling. But personally, I've always found the differences between certain skills to be too subtle for me to pick up on consistently. Take reaction speed and hand-eye coordination, for example. Try as I might, I don't think I could recall a single way to tell their voices apart, aside from the fact that the latter speaks up specifically when you're shooting a gun or trying to catch something. Esoteric Eb takes this formula and strips it down to the classic tabletop RPG stats: strength, constitution, dexterity, wisdom, intelligence, and charisma. Dividing our cleric's mind into just 6 parts gives them all a bit more room to breathe and showcase characteristics that extend beyond their pure mechanical use. For example, intelligence isn't just the cleric's ability to process and retain information. It also comes with a massive ego, stemming from the conviction that knowledge is power, and power is superiority over your peers. Wisdom, on the other hand, represents empathy and perceptivity, but it also stubbornly clings to its belief in the inherent good of all people, which simply isn't a practical stance to take in situations where people are behaving very, very badly. What I therefore appreciated most about Esoteric Eb's internal voices is that their distinctive temperaments helped me decide what kind of person I wanted my cleric to be. I valued dexterity above all other skills because I found its carefree yet ambitious personality the most fun to engage with. As an aspiring dick-ass rogue, it encouraged me to take chances and allowed me to gain the upper hand in some unorthodox ways. A little bit of constitution proved valuable, especially when it came to eating snacks from some rather questionable places. Strength, as useful as it seemed, was far too preoccupied with performative masculinity for my taste, so I only invested a few points in this category. A high wisdom stat felt like a natural way to keep the opportunism of dexterity and the pride of intelligence in check. Plus, it always felt like the voice I'd regret not listening to the most. As for charisma, talking to people is hard, okay? By the time I reached the final in-game day, I had a vibrant mental picture of who my cleric had become based on which internal voices I chose to nurture. And even the ones that weren't as compatible with my chosen playstyle felt like friends that were along for the ride. It's a concept I hope more games choose to adopt because, At the end of the day, no external NPCs can compare to ones who know you inside and out.